Hi there, Ryan Saddam, Chief Experience Officer at Client Savvy. Welcome back to the CXps 2021 Virtual Conference, Day 2. Today we work on winning hearts for your CX initiative. If the math during yesterday's event drove you nuts, today is going to be a lot more fun, especially since we have Andrea Mac leading us through this portion. Those who know Andrea or her company Prequal are already aware of how awesome today will be. Before we get started today, we do want to take a moment and recognize our sponsors, specifically calling out our gold sponsors, Full Sail Partners, Zweig Group, Brain, Talent Matters, and IntraHive. Thank you, sponsors. We couldn't do this without your support. For those who joined us yesterday, be sure to get your workbook out and ready for today's session. If you missed day 1, you can just jump right in. Your CX workbook should be in your inbox, or you can download a copy via the link in the Zoom chat right now. I also want to remind you to sign up for one of the 6 regional in-person events scheduled for 2021. I miss seeing all of you. And if you're new to CXps, I look forward to getting to meet you face-to-face. Check out clientexperience.org and sign up today. I also want to specifically address our CX cohorts and how those will evolve for 2021. Last year, most of you chose to participate in a CX cohort. Some worked really well, others never quite gelled. And I guess that's to be expected when we assigned each of you to a cohort and you really didn't have agency in that. So going forward, we've rethought the cohort model. If you visit the CXps website, you'll see a page dedicated to CX cohorts. Any member can propose a cohort, and we will promote your cohort within the CXps community. A cohort could be topical or general. It could be short-term or permanent. You can meet every day for a week and be done, or you can meet quarterly. In short, we want cohorts to work for you and want to let you design them as you see fit. If you'd like to collaborate with a focus group of peers, please submit your cohort proposal on the CXps website. We'll work with you to find your community. We know of one CXps member who founded a cohort with 5 of his peers. Their mission was to meet once a month for 6 months and work through redesigning the new client onboarding process. What ideas do you have? Let us know. We want to help. Tomorrow, we'll introduce you to CXPS's new certification program, so stay tuned for that. Now, I'd like to welcome Andrea Mac, growth strategist at Prequal. Andrea has been a member of the CXps community for several years, and those who have seen her speak before know we're in for a real treat. In fact, her session has been the top-rated session in 2 of the last 4 CXps events. Andrea will be bringing us winning hearts, telling your CX stories to engage leaders and colleagues.
I once knew this very prominent attorney. He was well known for being a problem solver around really complex challenges. He was burly, abrupt, aggressive, and had instincts like a tiger, maybe a bear. His client list was a mile long, filled with high-level executives, prominent community leaders, and influential people all over Chicago. He had a client, a CEO and founder of a very successful technology business. One day, out of the blue, the client stopped paying his bills. Calls weren't being returned. There weren't responses to legit work questions. It was incredibly unlike the client. The attorney then started getting pressured by the firm to get the invoices caught up. It was affecting cash flow, reconciling books, and creating a host of extra work and inconveniences for the law firm. The attorney finally got him on the phone, and instead of demanding payment or firing him as a client, as one would expect after being months in arrears, he took an appreciative inquiry approach, and he asked some questions. John, what's going on? Why haven't you returned my calls? Are you okay? Is everything okay? How's the family? And John, the client, he just broke down. We lost our lease. We need to move. And in between finding a place and negotiating terms and delivering on client contracts and just running day-to-day business, 2 key employees resigned, including my longtime assistant. You know what that attorney did next? He didn't fire the client. He didn't scold the client. He didn't even give advice like lawyers are well known to do. He walked out of his office, asked his own assistant to go pack up a box of supplies, markers, boxes, tapes, notepads, etc., and they got in the car. In less than an hour's time, they were at that client's office, lunch in hand. Put us to work, they said. And that client, because of that gesture by that lawyer and his own team, garnered a lifetime client, likely hundreds of referrals over the years, and loyalty that you just can't pay for. It didn't hurt that this technology company grew to become a household name you might even know. It wasn't that they made a huge impact that day. It was that the big-time hotshot lawyer was ready to get in the trenches at any moment without even being asked. This is the stuff that legends are made of. Hey everyone, I'm Andrea Mac. Welcome to day 2 of CXps. I founded a consultancy out of Chicago focused on driving innovation and revenue opportunities for professional women. Much of my career has been dedicated to attracting and engaging an audience. And really, I'm obsessed with transforming the way clients and employees experience brands. I open with that story about the attorney to preview what we aim to cover in today's session, the heart of your client experience program, storytelling and how to use storytelling to drive your CX objectives. Yesterday, we had the pleasure of having Ryan walk us through creating the business case for change. We used data, information, and leveraged ROI measurement to anchor your CX program and to problem solve. Anything that you hope to accomplish needs you to engage your audience, which requires a certain level of persuasion, not only at an intellectual level, but at those heartstrings as well. And the most productive tool for persuasion is storytelling. All of your firms here today have experiences, and all of your firms have stories. So our goal is to name the objective you're hoping to accomplish, identify the story that you want to use, hone it, develop it, drive it toward your objective, understand your audience and their needs, and to develop a plan for how you can use the legacy stories at your own firm. I think we can all agree on the importance of storytelling. I mean, you're here today, right? Storytelling is a very powerful and historical method. Think about it. It's the first form of marketing. It's the first form of training. And it's the original method for archiving knowledge. It's critical for you as a CX leader to have this tool in your toolkit and to be able to deploy it when needed because you represent that viewpoint of your customer within your organization. Storytelling can be used to illustrate proof, translate data and information into action, and create engagement both internally and externally. To accomplish any CX objective, regardless of where you're at in the development of your program and what you're working on today, you're going to need buy-in. You're going to need support for implementation and even budget allocation. Ultimately, the only way for you to execute your business strategy and drive organizational change is through people. If there's one thing that you take away from today's program, let it just be that sentence I just said. Write it down right now if you have to. The only way to execute your business strategy is through people. That becomes then really important to understand the science behind how people are most likely to engage with you. So much research points to that people make many decisions emotionally first, and then they justify that decision using rational data and thought process. Yet, when we try to sell our ideas or our plans, either whether it's our firm's services or even our own ideas and plans internally, we first base our proposition on rational data, and then we hope that our confidence and our conviction will trigger emotion that makes our audience buy in. I want you to take a moment and reflect on your own experience when presenting an idea or a plan internally, or even when you've had to listen to someone else's idea or approach. What were the most successful presentations? What sorts of emotions did they drive toward? Was it fear of missing out? Was it inspiration? Was it hope? Was it security for all of us? We want to trigger those emotions to increase adoption and move the needle forward. And we don't really want only buy-in, we want promoters. So, with your business objective in mind, I want you to consider that a critical conduit for triggering emotion is our messaging, when and while we're building an authentic relationship with our audience. When we listen, our brain fires emotionally and it stores multiple emotions every second. There are 3 V's that impact the effectiveness of our communication. There's visual, vocal, and verbal components in every message. Visual is the picture we form from the words we hear. Vocal is the tone we hear that helps us interpret meaning. And verbal is the word choice that we make to communicate intention. 55% of communication is visual, 38% is vocal, and only 7% is verbal. This is why things like email are so tricky to navigate with consistency and intention. When it comes to memory storage, imagine that a human mind is a high-rise condo building with a fixed number of units for residents. Memories, good and bad, take up the residents until there's a reason to kick them out and replace them with an updated view. When memories are negative, they trigger more residual emotion, like trauma. That can quickly get stored in the fixed mindset. When this happens, an active effort to displace and replace that memory is required to activate and tap into the growth mindset. This is why one of the most compelling forms of messaging is our storytelling. The human mind remembers stories 22 times more frequently than a statistic or other rational data. Sorry, Ryan. Thereby making storytelling our most effective way to trigger the emotion that you want the listener to remember. It was Maya Angelou that said it best when she said, "I may not remember exactly what you said, but I will never forget how you made me feel." So what's a good story? Let's talk about the architecture of a good story. It's more straightforward than you may think. Research also suggests that the essence of any good story follows a simple 3-step rubric, starting with 1, communication about the situation, followed then by actions and the impact and results that were achieved. SAI. If any of the 3 elements are missing, the story collapses. Further to this, emotion is triggered best when the storyteller demonstrates passion, uses appropriate and relatable humor, features circumstances that require grit, and positions initiative or ingenuity as a critical success factor. Think of a great storyteller that you respect. What do they do that makes them effective? One of my favorite examples to illustrate the SAI model is the Beverly Hillbillies theme song. Indulge me for a moment. And if you're so inclined and on mute, join in. Come and listen to a story about a man named Jed. A poor mountaineer barely kept his family fed. Then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground came a bubbling crude. Oil, that is, black gold, Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed's a millionaire. Kinfolk said, "Jed, move away from there." Said, "California is the place you ought to be." So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly Hills, that is. Swimming pools, movie stars. All the critical components to a good story. The situation, the impact, and the action. Your firm has a lot more stories than you probably even realize. We want to now give you the opportunity to identify your best client service story. A couple of elements or things to consider. Think through the most incredible thing you've done for a client. Maybe the most incredible thing a client has said about you. Maybe that's the furthest way an employee has gone to serve a client, or the biggest error you've corrected or recovered from. Consider a biggest win, how you won it, a big obstacle, how you overcame it, maybe even the most critical crisis you helped avert. Consider a situation you knocked it out of the park by listening better, how you've succeeded by focusing on the client's experience, and maybe even how you beat a competitor and stepped in to save the day. We're going to do our first breakout now. We'll put you in small groups to identify one of your firm's old legacy stories. I want you to use some of the elements I just described, also found in your workbook. And we're going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes for each of you to identify and share some stories among yourselves. We'll then invite you back to collaborate in the wider group. So later in our time together, we'll talk about how you can really use this story, tailor it to different audiences and your CX objectives wherever you're at on the continuum. But right now, just focus on finding your story. Okay, see you in a bit, everyone. I don't know about you, but my breakout room was pretty impressive. We had 3 participants that all had a story to share about lives saved, literal lives saved, like life and death CX stories. So I feel like in the name of storytelling and the impact that we are able to have through a client experience lens, these are great stories to start with. So Gary, if we can spotlight you, I'd love for you to be able to tell the wider group the story that you shared in our small breakout. So you just have to unmute and you can tell from there.
Yeah. So this was a story we tell. So safety, like probably everybody in here says safety is number one at my company, at your firm, and we strive to make sure we ensure a good safety culture. We had so one of our stories is we had an employee that was at a client site and on a job for us, and he noticed a contractor that was working some other job, didn't have anything to do with our project on site, that that was working elevated and did not have fall protection, and obvious violation of that plant's and OSHA rules. Well, within the month prior to this, this plant had experienced a fatality, and I believe it was a fall fatality as well. And so our employee saw this and did a stop work authority, stopped the work, and notified their supervisor, and really received a lot of verbal abuse from this contractors, and they didn't need to do this, and mind your own business, that sort of thing. And but they said they'd get it taken care of. Well, he went, saw them later that day, and they again were violating working elevated without fall protection. So he stopped work again, not knowing what was going to happen, whether he was going to get beat up by these people or notified the plant manager, didn't know if we were going to get kicked off the site for causing trouble or whatever it was. But the plant did the right thing and made them work with protection that they required. So our employee came back to the office. We heard about it. So our culture was such that we celebrated it. We gave this guy an award in front of a bunch of people. And, it would have been very easy for him to just minded his own business, walked on by, and, maybe nothing would have happened. But on the other side, he could very well have saved another fatality there at that plant and and in the industry. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Gary, for sharing.
Yeah.
I love this story, and I think it's important to share it widely because it's very atypical, right? It doesn't have anything to do with what is typically tied to client experience, like an event or a gift or delivering quality work. This is a story about going against the grain. And frankly, if you've read anything I've written or presented before, you know that I believe CX begins with your EX. And so the fact that Gary's company celebrated the employee and promoted the employee and promoted the story, even when it wasn't a client initiated request or even desire, if you will, for them to step in, it really drives and cements what's important to us in delivering client experience, even when those clients aren't asking for that particular action. So thank you, Gary, for being brave enough to go first and share with the whole group. And thanks for that story to show us that CX looks like a lot of different things. I have a note that Chris Reddy has a story to share, a great story that the group could benefit from. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us.
Okay, I guess I've been voluntold, as we said. The story I shared is Decreed Engineering. We're a provider of civil engineering surveying services to private clients, don't really do public work. And the owner of our company is real entrepreneurial. He's not just an engineer, but he really understands our client's world. And several years ago, he came up with this model. We now call it the 9-box model, which internally in our 4 walls, it's always been all about the engineering. We're engineers, that's what we do. But he's astute enough to know that to these developers, engineering is just one facet of their world. They have so many different things going on. And he came up with this 9-box model that includes other elements of their world, like financing, the vision for the project, the political portion of it, the legal aspects of it, etc. With the point being that we want our client-facing managers to be in tune with all those aspects of that client's project so that we can walk in their shoes. So when we're trying to win business, we can tell this story of how we're going to be different than other engineers. Other engineers might be great at engineering, but so are we. But we're going to bring this where we know your world. We're going to not only try and help you with your engineering issues, but we're going to try and help you navigate all those related areas, because a lot of times there's crossover. And it's been super successful. I commented that the biggest project we had landed in our history several years back would have certainly gone to a national player under ordinary circumstances, but the owner of our firm and one of our other principals who's on this call was able to get in, tell that compelling story, and we won that project. The national competitors lost out on it. And the best part about that is once we had that on our list of projects, it's on our website, it opened up so many other avenues for us with other major players, other major projects. So that model has been a real difference maker for our firm.
I love it. Thank you for sharing. It's like you guys are building out the second portion of my presentation. It's great. You're just leading me to water. Last one, I think there was a story about donuts. Brittany, do you have a story about donuts that you'd like to share with the wider group?
Yes, I'm sure. Donuts are certainly not life and death, I will say that. But we're an architecture engineering firm, and we actually do a lot of work with municipalities, public works departments, stuff like that. And I also live in upstate New York, so it's always terrible weather. I know a lot of people on this call don't suffer with the snow the way we do. But we had a storm a couple of years ago that lasted forever. And people were plowing for almost 3 days straight, even long after the snow had stopped falling. A lot of restaurants were closed. A lot of things were staying home. It was not safe outside for a very long time. And there were some donut shops in town that had opened in the beginning and they were closing, and they said, come by, give us $1. You can take as many donuts as you want. We just need to all get home. And a couple of our project managers grabbed basically all the donuts these places had, and they went around to all of the DPW departments that we work with and dropped them off because the guys had been slugging snow for so long. We got phone calls from relatives of people who worked at the DPW, people who knew them, and people who just heard through the grapevine that everyone felt so seen by us. Like, we knew that they were going through this hard time. We had reached out, tried to help make it a little bit better and everything. And it really stuck out in like 3 of our clients' minds. They still talk about it, and it was probably 2 or 3 winters ago. So that was kind of one of our stories.
I love it. Thank you for sharing. It's just a testament to humanity, in those moments of what people want. At that point, they didn't want, printouts and reports telling them the value you add and your great awards you've won. They wanted donuts and to be home with their family. And so to identify a need as human and basic in those moments, those tough weather moments, even, I think that illustrates such an important piece of humanity. I mean, so life and death and donuts, 2 are the same, kind of, right? But these are all great stories, and these are examples of what makes a good story, right? The 3 of you were just storytellers in that. But it's not just enough to have a good story, right? You guys are here today to figure out how to take those stories. And the fact that everyone in every group had a story to share, either that has happened at your firm or that you've experienced, illustrates that there are many assets for us to work with. But this session isn't just about collecting those. It's about how can we take that story as an asset to drive your CX goals in your firm? So how do you change what's folklore and turn it into action and then results? This is why storytelling is a tool, and it's not only about entertainment. So let's talk a little bit about how you can use these stories in your CX programs. So you touched on this, the 3 of you that shared your stories, thank you very much. You touched a little bit on this. You have different audiences when it comes to your stories, right? There's your firm leadership, your C-suite, those in decision-making positions. There's your employees, colleagues, teams, the people that make up the actual delivery of the client experience. There's your prospects. Those are your future clients, your future employees. You've got the clients themselves, right? The person that actually received the experience and everyone else who's receiving an experience with your firm. And then there's the market at large. These are the people that you want to attract to your firm and those that you want to get your message out to, right? So the expectation is that we communicate, and we create alignment around our systems and foundation for client experience. And a story is one piece of that. So the expectation is that you will engage more confidently with these audiences and direct your message toward them. Let's talk about different ways that you can do that. So those of you that have heard me present before know that one of my CX philosophies is to not start something new. It is to take something that people are used to seeing and attach your initiative or goal to what they're already accustomed to. It makes a huge difference, especially not only in driving CX when everyone has a different opinion of what CX is, but also in change management and driving your goals. So some of the ways is if we can agree on these 5 buckets of main audiences, here are a couple of examples of ways that we can tie to something that already exists. So how can you use that story in planning? What about how we design the process moving forward? What about a measurement of your investment of time and your actions? And measuring as it relates to not only your employee performance, maybe even compensation, but also the measurement of the growth on that account. So were we able to make these investments into an account, a group of accounts, a particular industry, and then measure whether or not they had an impact on our goal with those particular clients? As it relates to your internal audience, these stories can be used to train and coach other employees, not only in onboarding or new, but as ongoing commitment to delivering a client experience and the client experience that presumably you specifically designed, which leads us to the socialization of your CX. Again, CX has many meanings to many different audiences. So when you're able to root and anchor around a story as an example, like if we go back to Gary's example of the employee stepping out of their traditional bounds to call out a client on a safety measure, you can use that to really relay why a CX investment is important, because here is the result of this investment. It's also to engage your employees. People like storytelling. It's entertaining. It's interesting. We're curious. We are nosy. We are competitive. And so anytime you can use storytelling to engage teams or to involve many team members and align your teams, it's really an incredible tool. Now, prospects. So when you're networking and someone says to you, hey, what's new? How's it going? Or what does your firm do? When you lead with a proactive message about how you're different and you can illustrate that with a story, I guarantee that audience is going to remember it. And I think it was Chris that shared that they used their story in a variety of new sales opportunities, RFPs, marketing materials. This is your website. This is your content. These are your case studies. These are your testimonials. You can use stories to drive and illustrate the point. So it's one thing to say we're really committed to client experience, or we deliver a really different client experience. But when you can use these stories to illustrate that, it really helps buyers buy, if you will. And it really helps differentiate you between your competitors. So then let's talk about clients. Why would a client care about an example story of you delivering an experience to another client? Where would that be important? Business reviews. So when you do annual check-ins, quarterly reviews, we like to use our stories, or we used to like to use our stories to kick off where we're at in our business and what's important to us and how we're shaping our planning and goals. So you can use this as part of your agenda for your business reviews. You can also use it when you're asking for or designing around cross-selling opportunities. So if you're trying to sell a safety service or a development project, or sell around the urgency of a project, you can use your stories to illustrate and make introduction to other areas of your firm. You can also use it for feedback request. So you can use it to build out your communication when you're soliciting feedback from your clients. And it's a great way, again, to illustrate there's a difference between saying, would you fill out the survey or would you take this interview, as telling a story and then inviting to say, we'd like to know if you've had a similar experience. I also encourage you to think about how you can use this story to the market in general. So as I mentioned before, people reading these things about your firm are future employees or clients. And using this story allows you to give an idea and a feel for what the culture is at your firm, what the values are at your firm, and for how that translates into day-to-day. And that day-to-day communication I mentioned earlier, I like to use storytelling, especially CX, when I'm catching up with people. So if I run into someone at a networking event, or I'm having lunch with a friend and they say, how's it going? What's new? I like to use these stories to say, let me tell you about how great this firm is that I work with. Well, here's a story of what happened recently. Or here's why I love working for this firm. This story illustrates really how we put people first. And so when you use your stories in day-to-day communication, it really drives other objectives and goals. And the last idea that I offer up is environmental branding. So how can you incorporate stories to meet people when they're where they're at? So instead of us pushing our stories at people when they're ready to receive them. So that's a simple way to incorporate storytelling in a variety of capacities. I do think it's important for us to try it together. And so I'd like to remind you of the story that I presented at the beginning about the attorney who had a billing issue, went and helped his client. So I want to walk you through how we were able to take that story and turn it into different components of communication. So the first thing, firm leadership. We used it to measure our clients' growth over a period of time. We said, historically, what was their trajectory prior to the CX, let's call it investment, and what was their trajectory afterward? We measured referrals from that client, and we were able to use that as benchmark data to compare it in the industry. So does CX really make a difference? Well, let's look at a technology company where we made CX investments that we can point to, and let's compare it to where it was natural course of business. And let's see if there was a difference. And if you do that on an industry basis, you can really measure. So that's one example of how we used it relative to firm leadership in planning, measurement, ROI, which also helpful, allowed us to secure additional budget to experiment with other things later. So I highly encourage you to consider using it this way. Employees, colleagues, we use this as training in our accounting department. So I don't know about your firms, but typically finance professionals are very tactical. It's very factual, it's data driven, it's based on that, right? So does your finance person really care about this attorney that went and helped this client move their office and helped them get back up and running? Where does that make an impact? And so we used it as a training module when someone wasn't there paying their bills to reach out and illustrate why you had to ask additional questions, why all cases shouldn't be treated equally, how we could script it out to approach it with appreciative inquiry versus just sending follow-up statements or putting them on the no work list or making assumptions, if you will. So that story was built out in our training along with the data from step 1 to script and train our accounting and our receivables department. We also used it, as we mentioned earlier, in marketing materials, your traditional sort of content. So we asked that client if they would give us a testimonial, if we could include it in our pitches, if we could name them by name and use that to leverage into here's an example of where we've made a difference in a person's life at a critical moment and in the course of this company's life. And given that they were so appreciative, that client allowed us to name them publicly, and then we used it to leverage additional opportunities. As I mentioned as an example in the last slide, we also used it as an introduction in our client interviews. So typically, it's scary for firms to say, I want to put that story out there because what if 90% of our other clients haven't had that same experience, right? That's usually a place that causes hesitation. And so then we don't end up leveraging the asset because we're afraid that other clients are going to come out of the woodwork and say, well, hey, what about me? I never got that experience. You just keep sending me invoices. So this is usually where the story starts to lose steam and alignment internally breaks down, right? We let fear make that decision. For us, we decided to test it by telling the story in the introduction to our request for an interview. We said, here's a great story we want to share. It's what we're committed to. It's how we're committed to behaving. And this is a really important story for you to know where we place our stake in the ground. We would love to talk to you about the level of experience you've had with our firm. Can you say the same? Is there anything we should know about? Can you say you're receiving this level of attention? And so for us, it really allowed us an authentic place to begin in a way that didn't seem self-serving, but allowed us to really position ourselves as people. And that's, for us, that always garnered far more participation and awareness. So it's an example of how you can use this with current clients. And last, I touched on this earlier, when anyone would ask me why, and I loved working where I was working, or how have you stayed there so long, or what's so great about this company, it gave me a very natural way to illustrate how we were different. And then that immediately turns into further interest. and additional opportunities. So they'll say, that's so great because I know someone who has a terrible experience with their law firm, or my law firm never does that, or I want to work for a place like that. And so when you use a story in day-to-day communication, it really opens the conversation in a variety of ways. I've also used it to shift personal relationships to professional relationships. And so in a previous capacity with a business development focused, I was able to take that story in the course of an authentic conversation and now allow my friends to see what I did professionally and open the door to transition some of those relationships. So those are examples of ways that you can now take these great stories that we talked about in breakout number 1 and really put them to use. Like, how do you leverage them? How do you take a story through all of your different audiences and create artifacts? And furthermore, what do you want then the audience to think, feel, or do when you share this story? Do you want them to reach out to you? Do you want them to give you more business? Do you want them to ask you more? Do you want them to feel protected? Do you want them to feel curious? So I really want you to think through how you now take the story. And if your story wasn't good in breakout number 1, go ahead and take someone else's story. That's okay. We're not going to be calling you out on that. Or take a story of an experience that you've had with a brand that you've loved. And we're going to go into breakout number 2, and we're going to take your story and we're going to begin mapping it so that you have an action item around your one great story. So if you go to page 7 in your workbook, there's a chart that you can use that will guide you through the various audiences and to help you think through what you might want your audience to think, feel, or do. So work on it together, collaborate, brainstorm, share examples. Feel free to come back after the breakout and let us know if there was something that was missed, a really great example. I think we can all benefit from ideation here and sharing our best practices. So you're going to go into breakout room number 2. You'll have somewhere between 12 minutes and 15 minutes to work on this together. And then we'll come back and we'll share our examples of how we can implement our story. Hey, everyone, welcome back. So I think I have to share my screen again. See it. Okay. So how did that feel? How'd that go? I would love to share some examples of some of the ways we applied the stories that we identified in breakout number 1 and talk about how we were able to translate that on different channels and in different ways. So I'm going to call in somebody who was in my group because I got to hear a story about live saved, and how that story can be applied in a number of ways. So if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Updike, would you mind sharing how you are planning to use the story that you've identified as your legacy story and how you plan to share it with leadership?
Yeah, sure. Just a quick overview is we constructed a temporary alternative facility for Montana Children's Hospital, added 98 extra rooms to their capacity in less than 3 weeks, and so it was a pretty big undertaking. And when I think about how to make this story powerful to affirm leadership, it really shows our firm's commitment to the communities that we serve. That's what we want to certainly demonstrate that to our executive leadership, that it's a very, very strong and powerful statement on our commitment. You don't work 6, 7, 8, 9-hour days when you're doing something like that. And then how do we want to make them feel? We really want to, we want them to know and understand that the confidence that they place in that is well earned and well deserved. And so when we get pushed to our limits, we respond, or the folks in the firm respond with actions that are worthy of that confidence. And so it should increase. We want them to feel like an increased confidence in our capabilities and the capacity of the work that we have to do. As far as integration channels, I provide a quarterly update to our executive leadership within our firm, and so I can use this story to talk about how we accomplished it, how it really used our systems and processes and approach to accomplish what we needed to our clients to have accomplished.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So Doug had all the right components to that story, right? He had a situation, he had urgency, he had impact, he had all of the right components for a good story, right? It's timely, it's about COVID, it's about children, it's about hospital beds. And he used a very important word that we didn't yet use, which was confidence. So the purpose of Doug gathering that story and sharing it is to instill confidence, not only with clients, but also with his leadership. And why is that important? Because he wants them to know that they can be trusted. His teams can be trusted to deliver in an urgent way. And that's incredibly useful, not only as a reflection of their personal commitment, but also, let's say Doug wants to go for additional budget later. Let's say Doug wants to ask for additional resources. This is a great story to plant and point back to. So thank you, Doug, for sharing that. And thank you for your work. So I heard that there was another story by Jennifer Karnitzschnig. Did I do that? Did I say that right? Well done. I get bonus points. So Jennifer, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your story, like a quick overview of your story, and then how you plan to implement that story across a channel.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Andrea. So this story, I come from a company that has about 5,000 or so people scattered across the world, mostly domestically. And we provide program support, technical assistance to mostly government clients. And when we started we call it the client listening program, there were a lot of people who were afraid to ask their clients for feedback. And so the story really is in one particular place in an international project, the project manager and the people in general in that group were very reticent to use the tool that we had and the process and the program that we had set up to ask their clients for feedback. And they found out they eventually did ask for feedback, and what they got back was a little different than what they thought. And that they were saying, I talk to the project every day, I know what they're going to say. And the client came back with some interesting feedback regarding a very high profile part of the program, which had to do with the agency that they were supporting. So a communication plan that they were delivering as part of the project was not meeting their needs. It had a lot of visibility, not just within that agency, but within the international development world. So they very quickly kind of huddled and traveled to the country, met with the client, and really made some significant changes to that program to help change the dynamic and what was going on that project. So it not only impacted that one project, but it impacted other people within the international development group, the business unit that's their main client. So it had a big ripple effect in terms of that story. And so the challenge for me is that there's a lot of stories like that across the organization, and getting that word out there sometimes is a bit, how do you do that with a large organization? So every year we do an annual report out to our executives, and we include stories like that, those high impact stories, to help people understand the value of the program, how we can help our clients, how it can really make a difference particularly in these major projects that we're doing, which is to improve the human condition. So it's about helping people in these countries. And so telling that story at the high level, but then also how do I get it down into the rest of the organization? And my colleagues in my group, or Betty Staley and others, were very helpful in giving me some ideas. One, rely on the team. We have business unit representatives, get them to tell the story, get them to share the story, and also share it within their peer groups and on down. And then another great idea from Ryan was building a deck of a PowerPoint where you have 4 slides, and on each slide you have a really compelling story, and then you share that, the executives share that story, and then they send it to the next level, and then they share it, and people get to practice telling the story. And so, that, in addition to using technology, we use Yammer, we use Teams, we have an external website where we're going to be compiling some of the stories so our clients can see them. So that really using all all the different ways that you can meet people where they're at and consume the information in ways that's interesting, like videos instead of just print, things like that. So my team had some great ideas to help me, and I want to thank them all. So that's it.
Yay, thank you, team. That's awesome. And we didn't even go into modalities today. So that's a whole nother session if Ryan will let me have, day 4 of this conference. But I think that's great, Jennifer, too, also because I like it as an intervention, to be honest, like how you shared that story. And I thought it was just lawyers that said, no, I would know if something was wrong. No, we'd be good. Everything's fine. They're paying their bill. They're doing this. We check in daily I talk to them daily. So it's really interesting to hear it used that way. And I can imagine that it would be a very useful intervention to say, well, let me just tell you a story where we thought everything was okay and the impact of moving ahead with a feedback request regardless. So I love that story as almost like a rebuttal for lack of better word, but as an interception and a rebuttal to push back when we want to engage or initiate CX investments or requests. So thank you very much for sharing that. I think that's an excellent example. Is there anyone else that wants to share before we move on? That's what I imagined would happen. So I'm on to the next slide, which is cool. You've got this great story. You now have ideas on how you can use this story. You've got channels, you've thought through modalities, you've thought through why people will care about this story. And this story and storytelling in general is just one tool in your toolkit. And it's important, right? Because we need to engage people. So how do we make sure that storytelling isn't just a tool that resides with you, or as someone mentioned earlier, isn't just this one story that's told over time? So a couple of things on what to take back to your companies, your firms, and what to do next with this. So someone mentioned, I think it was Jennifer, collecting and auditing your stories. So what are places that you can go gather these stories and start creating a toolkit of stories to be used so that it isn't your one legacy story, but that it's also, as mentioned in our breakout group, it's these micro moments. So it isn't delivering your CX, and those stories aren't always going to be, the $5 billion project or the hospital built or the life saved. Oftentimes CX is on these daily interactions with your clients and these daily responses and this daily effort. And so it's important to capture a variety of stories with a variety of audiences that you can examine from a number of lenses. So I encourage you next as a step to think through how you can collect those stories from your clients and internally so that we have a variety of perspectives to build with. And I would encourage you to start by defining the objective or the tactic or using your CX charter and anchoring around those first. And in gathering those stories, you can build out a repository. I also think as a step 2, I'm going to encourage you to use team storytelling to advance your goals. And team storytelling means you're not the only ambassador. You're not the only one telling the story, the only one incorporating storytelling into your mechanisms and your tools. Storytelling becomes a group approach. So we all agree this story is important. It aligns across a number of perspectives at our firm, and we're going to learn how to tell it together. So both Doug and I agree this is a good story. How are we going to bring this story to market efficiently? You see this often in your sales pitches, right? Cohesion, sharing value, all anchored around an objective you have. Therefore, there's no waste in the communication that you're presenting to your audience. And third is continuously creating opportunities for your audience to practice. So how can you incorporate storytelling into internal meetings, into daily conversation over coffee? How do you use storytelling and the repository of storytelling to make sure that everyone in your company, or majority of people in your company, are comfortable collecting the stories, sharing the stories, and utilizing in their own mechanisms? So this isn't just, we've pretty much run the gamut today. We all agree storytelling is important. It's a strong tool to use. It helps you get buy-in. It helps you get engagement. And for advancing your experience programs, you're going to need buy-in and engagement. So storytelling is a good tool. Collect the stories around the values that your firm anchors around and the objectives and goals that you've defined as a firm, and then identify ways to use them and practice. So pretty brilliant, pretty simple. I know we are running up on time, and I could talk about this all day long. So I want to make sure that we have a couple minutes for any questions. If there's anything anyone wants to share, there's anything you have a question about for me or for someone else in the audience, now is your time. I'm also available if you have any questions or you need an idea or you want to practice or talk through a story that you have or what you're thinking. I am an endless pit of ideas. And so if there's anything that you would love just an extra brain on, feel free to reach out to me. There on this fancy slide is not only my picture, but also my email address and a number that you can text. And then of course, follow my company on socials for ongoing conversation around the experience that you deliver. Thank you everyone for your time.
Hey, Andrea,
Thank you.
thank you so much. That was great. Good stuff. I know I had some great conversations, heard some great stories today, and thanks to everyone who shared. Come back tomorrow for day 3. Chandra will be walking us through day 3. Chandra, I see you on video if you want to wave for everyone. We've really talked about some of the tools between return on investment, using stories. Tomorrow, we're going to start really wrapping that all together and discuss how do we really align all of this with our business strategy. I think Andrea said it today, so that this doesn't become one more thing on the plate, but we really look at client experience as an accelerant or fuel to drive what you're already trying to do faster, further, more effectively. So Chandra is going to bring us through that. We'll again have a lot of breakout time to discuss and brainstorm and share ideas with each other. So be there for that. And then also do check out the clientexperience.org website. We'd love to get you guys signed up for one of the regional events. We want to see you there. And stay tuned tomorrow for a preview of the new Client Experience Management Professional certification that's available for the first time. So I think that wraps us all up. I committed to getting everyone out of here a minute early, and I think I got about 20 seconds left to deliver on that promise. So we'll stick around if anyone has any questions or wants to discuss anything. I'll be here until no one else is, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.